Before we get into the logs, I want you to look at something. On the windowsill of my kitchen, there's a chipped blue glass jar. It's filled with seaglass, bits of green, brown, and the rare cobalt blue, all worn smooth by decades of Atlantic salt and tide. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, once tried to throw it out, calling it clutter for a dusty life. What she didn't know was that every piece in that jar was collected by my wife, Elena, on the very stretch of beach Chloe tried to sell to a billionaire's resort. And more importantly, she didn't know that those pieces of glass aren't just memories, they're evidence. Under a microscope, the mineral composition of that glass proves the exact shifting of the mean high water mark, a technicality that can turn a multi-million-dollar development into a federal crime scene in a single afternoon. Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. I have lived in this cottage for 40 years. It's built of cedar and salt, tucked into a notch of the Maine coastline where the Atlantic doesn't just visit, it resides. I know the rhythm of the tides the way a musician knows a metronome. I know when a storm is 12 hours out because the air turns heavy and the gulls stop screaming and start hiding. I was sitting on my deck, the wood silvered by decades of sun and spray. My granddaughter, Maya, was at my feet. She's 7, with hair the color of wet sand and a mind that's always building. Our ritual is the barrier. We take smooth river stones and line them up against the encroaching tide, talking about how the weight of the rock has to fight the energy of the wave. It's a lesson in physics, though she just thinks we're playing. "Grandpa, this one is too light," Maya said, holding up a piece of quartz. "The water will take it home." "Then we find a heavier one, Maya," I said, my voice as gravelly as the shore. "In this life, you have to be heavier than what's trying to pull you under." I checked my Casio, 9:15 a.m. The tide was coming in, and so was the trouble. The sound of a luxury engine, something European and far too delicate for these backroads, cut through the sound of the surf. A silver Mercedes pulled into the gravel drive, looking like a surgical instrument dropped into a rock quarry. Chloe, my daughter-in-law. She stepped out, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her face, it was the smell. A sharp, expensive citrus perfume that fought against the salt air like an intruder. She was dressed for a gala, not a coastline, white linen pants and heels that immediately sank into the gravel. She looked at the cottage with a thin, tight expression, the way someone looks at a stain they can't quite scrub out. She was carrying a leather portfolio. It was slim, embossed with gold initials, not hers. A corporate logo, Azure Sands Development. "Arthur," she said, stepping onto the deck with a gingerly gait as if the wood might give way. She didn't hug me. Chloe doesn't believe in physical contact that doesn't involve a handshake or a swipe of a credit card. "You're looking weathered, truly." "The ocean has a way of doing that, Chloe," I said. I didn't get up. I've spent 40 years standing for men that didn't deserve it. I've earned the right to sit. "What brings you out here? The city get too quiet for you?" She set the portfolio on the small cedar table right next to my coffee mug, a heavy, stained thing that used to belong to my father. "Actually, I've been doing some thinking about your future and Maya's." She didn't look at Maya. She looked at the shoreline, specifically the 300 yards of pristine private beach that Elena and I had spent our lives protecting. "The upkeep on this place, Arthur, it's a drain," she continued,
her voice taking on that practiced melodic tone of a social climber pitching a brand. "The salt air is eating the foundation. The roof needs $10,000 in work. Your pension is respectable, but it wasn't meant to support a sinking ship. I've taken the liberty of drafting a restructuring plan for your estate." I watched her. I noted the gold watch on her wrist, a Piaget if I wasn't mistaken. It cost more than the truck I've driven for 15 years. I noted the way she didn't look at the ocean. She looked at the square footage of the lot. "A restructuring plan," I repeated. The words felt like sand in my mouth. "It's for the best, Arthur. There's a new development project, high-end, sustainable. They're looking for anchor properties to convert into a private club for the Azure Sands Resort. You'd get a generous buyout, enough to put you in that new Silver Palms facility in Portland, full medical, a gym, and people your own age to talk to. No more shoveling snow, no more worrying about the tide." She talked about the house as if it were a liability, a sinking ship. She didn't mention that the Silver Palms facility was a glorified holding pen for people waiting to die. "I like the tide, Chloe, and the roof doesn't leak as much as you'd think. I patched it last spring." She sighed, a sign of staged exasperation. "Arthur, be realistic. You're 74. You can't keep living like a hermit. The house needs to be put into better use. This land is worth millions, and it's just sitting here, rotting." She used that word, rotting. My home. The place where Elena had lived and died. The place where Maya's height was marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe. "I'll take a look at your papers, Arthur," I said, leaning back. I kept my hands steady, even as the cold dread started to settle in my marrow. "I'll move fast, Arthur, even if you don't." She tapped the portfolio. "I've already had a preliminary appraisal done. The developers are ready to move. They just need the green light from the family." She walked back to her Mercedes, her heels clicking on the deck like the ticking of a bomb. She didn't look back at Maya, who was still trying to stack her stones. She didn't see me pick up my coffee and watch the silver car disappear around the bend. I stood up and walked down to the water's edge. I knelt next to Maya. "Is the wall strong enough, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice small. "Not yet, Maya," I said. I looked at the horizon, where the deep blue of the Atlantic met the pale gray of the sky. I felt a coldness in my chest. It wasn't the sea breeze. It was the feeling of a predator in the tall grass. Chloe thought I was a retired man whose mind was as weathered as his siding. She'd forgotten that before I retired, I was a senior inspector for the Army Corps of Engineers. I spent 30 years deciding who got to build on the water and who didn't. I spent my career measuring the strength of foundations and the legality of shorelines. I went into the house and pulled my old leather field bag out of the closet. It smelled of damp paper and old brass. I opened the side drawer of my desk and took out a set of bathymetric charts and a high-precision laser level. The first crack wasn't in the house, it was in the family. And I knew right then and there that Chloe had made the biggest mistake of her social climbing life. She thought she was selling a house. She didn't realize she was trying to sell a federal shoreline to a man who knew every inch of its legal armor.
The following week was a masterclass in the quiet art of psychological erosion. Chloe didn't attack, she assisted. She arrived every morning with a smile that was as bright and as artificial as a stadium floodlight, bringing with her a rotating cast of experts to help me see the reality of my situation. On Tuesday, it was a property manager named Julian, a man whose teeth were too white and whose handshake was too soft. They didn't talk to me, they talked at me, usually while I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the window. "The structural integrity of the pilings is really the main concern, Chloe," Julian said, standing on my deck and tapping a clipboard. He didn't actually crawl under the house to look at the cedar posts I'd reinforced with concrete 5 years ago. He just looked at the salt-grade wood and shook his head. In a heavy surge, this whole kitchen could just slide into the Atlantic. It's a liability waiting to happen. "It breaks my heart, Julian," Chloe replied, her voice reaching that pitch of manufactured tragedy. She turned to me, her eyes wide with performative pity. "Arthur, did you hear that? Julian says the house is unsafe. I can't sleep at night knowing you and Maya are under this roof. It's a miracle the last northeaster didn't take it." I sat there, my hands folded over my lap. I knew those pilings. I'd driven them deep into the bedrock myself, using the same specifications we used for federal pier construction. They weren't sliding anywhere. But I didn't argue. I just watched the way Julian's eyes kept darting toward the shoreline, calculating the cost of a bulkhead. "I'll take it under advisement, Chloe," I said. My voice was a dry rasp. "But the house has stood since 1954. It's got a bit of grit left in it." Chloe sighed, that long whistling sound of a woman burdened by an old man's stubbornness. "Arthur, that's the forgetfulness talking. You remember the leak in the pantry? You told me you fixed it, but I saw a water spot yesterday. And where are the maintenance logs? I tried to find the receipts for the roof work you mentioned, but the drawer was empty. Are you sure you actually did it?" I knew exactly where those receipts were. They were in the second drawer of my desk, filed behind the tax returns. But when I'd checked that morning, they were gone. Chloe had been busy while I was out walking the shore with Maya. She was deleting the history of the house, trying to create a vacuum where only her narrative existed, the narrative of a crumbling home and a crumbling mind. She started leaving brochures for assisted living, glossy pamphlets featuring silver-haired actors playing chess in air-conditioned rooms. She'd accidentally leave her phone on the table with a real estate listing for a penthouse in Portland pulled up. "Look at the light in this one, Arthur," she'd say, showing me a glass box in the sky. "No salt to scrub, no grass to mow, just peace. Don't you want peace?" She was trying to make me feel like the ocean was my enemy. She spoke about the wind as if it were a predator and the salt as if it were poison. She called me dear and sweetheart with a condescending pat on the hand that felt like a dismissal. To her, I wasn't the man who had overseen the dredging of the Kennebec River. I was a piece of antique furniture that no longer fit the decor of her life. "I'm just worried about your episodes, Arthur," she said on Thursday, leaning against the counter. "Like yesterday when you couldn't find your keys for 20 minutes. It's starting to happen more often, isn't it? Even Maya noticed. She asked me why Grandpa was wandering around the porch looking lost." That was a lie. I hadn't lost my keys. Chloe had moved them to the top of the refrigerator, a place I never look, and Maya hadn't said a word. The girl and I had been busy identifying a nesting pair of plovers. Chloe was using the child as a whetstone to sharpen her blade. She was trying to gaslight a man who had spent 30 years identifying non-conformities in federal contracts. She thought that because I moved slower, I thought slower. She thought that because I didn't yell, I didn't have teeth. I let her think it. I played the part. I'd squint at the brochures and say, "That's a lot of glass, Chloe. Seems expensive to heat." I'd let a little bit of confusion creep into my eyes when she'd ask about the missing receipts. I wanted her to feel bold. I wanted her to feel so confident in her victory that she'd start taking shortcuts. And she did. On Friday afternoon, I saw her in her Mercedes, talking animatedly into her Bluetooth headset. She was holding a document with a blue seal on it. Even from 30 feet away, I recognized the layout of a power of attorney form. She wasn't waiting for me to sign anything anymore. She was making her own reality. I went back to my armchair and picked up the seaglass jar. I turned a piece of cobalt blue over in my hand. Chloe thought she was erasing my life, one receipt at a time. She didn't realize that I was the one recording every move she made. I was filing it all away in a log she would never find.
If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. I closed the folder. I made coffee. I waited.
I walked the shoreline at low tide, the sand firm and cold beneath my boots. The Atlantic had retreated, leaving behind a glistening expanse of tide pools and ribbed silt, revealing the bones of the earth that stay hidden for most of the day. This was the hour Elena loved most. She used to walk this stretch with a chipped blue glass jar tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the debris for ocean jewels. She wasn't looking for gold or silver. She was looking for seaglass, the sharp, broken shards of human waste that the ocean had spent decades tumbling, smoothing, and refining until they became something soft and translucent. I stopped at a cluster of rocks near the old jetty. I could almost see her there, her yellow raincoat a bright splash against the gray Atlantic mist. She'd spend hours out here, humming a low tune that always got lost in the wind. She used to say that the ocean was the only thing in the world that didn't have an agenda. It just moved because it had to. It was honest in its violence and its peace. I went back to the cottage and sat at the kitchen table, the blue jar of seaglass sitting in the center of the wood like a shrine. I pulled out her old storm logs, parchment paper bound in leather, filled with her elegant sloping handwriting in blue ink. October 14th. The surge reached the third dune tonight. The sea oats held. We are lucky to have such stubborn neighbors. This land wasn't just a view or a prime development site to Elena. It was a barrier. It was the skin between our family and the rest of the world. We'd raised our son here, teaching him to respect the water, though it seems he'd forgotten those lessons the moment he married into Chloe's world of glass and high-rises. I remember the night of the '78 blizzard. The power went out, and the wind was screaming like a banshee through the cedar shakes. Most people would have been terrified, but Elena just lit the kerosene lamps and sat by the hearth, polishing a piece of green glass. "The house isn't moving, Arthur," she'd said, her voice steady enough to anchor the whole coast. "We built it on the rock. The water can knock at the door all at once, but it isn't coming in." She was the moral spine of this house. She was the reason the copper was polished and the logs were kept. She believed that a home wasn't something you restructured or flipped. It was something you inhabited until the dust claimed it. Chloe wanted to flatten the dunes, the very dunes Elena had spent years planting with sea oats to prevent erosion, to build an infinity pool. She wanted to replace the cedar shakes with floor-to-ceiling glass that wouldn't last a single Maine winter without cracking. She wanted to erase the smell of wood smoke and replace it with the scent of $400 candles. It was an insult to the woman who lived here, an insult to the way Elena died, quietly in the bedroom upstairs with the sound of the waves providing the last rhythm she ever heard. I picked up a piece of cobalt blue glass from the jar. It was rare, the color of the deep water beyond the shelf. Elena had found it on our 25th anniversary. She'd held it up to the sun and said, "This took a long time to get this smooth, Arthur. We should be so lucky." The weight of our 40 years together pressed against my chest, a physical ache that felt like the pressure of the deep sea. I wasn't just defending a piece of real estate. I was defending the sanctuary of a woman who wasn't here to speak for herself. Chloe saw a deteriorating asset. I saw the place where I'd held my wife's hand for the last time. I looked at the blue ink in the logs. Elena had recorded the mean high watermark every season for decades. She'd noted the erosion rates and the way the sand shifted near the northern boundary. To a casual observer, it was a diary of a nature lover. To me, with my background in the Army Corps of Engineers, it was a baseline environmental study. Chloe thought I was a grieving widower whose mind was wandering in the past. She didn't realize that the past is the only place where the truth is properly documented.
She didn't realize that I was using Elena's memories to build a legal fortress that no social climber could ever scale. I remembered her laugh, a bright, clear sound that used to cut right through the heaviest fog. It felt like she was in the room for a moment, a phantom scent of lavender and salt air. "The house isn't moving, Elena," I whispered into the quiet kitchen. I felt a hard, cold resolve take root in my gut. Chloe had pushed me to the edge, thinking I would simply fall over. She didn't realize that I've spent my life studying the way edges are built and how they are defended. I stood up and put the blue jar back on the windowsill. The light caught the cobalt glass, casting a blue shadow across the counter. I went into my study and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out my old USACE field kit, the brass calipers, the laser rangefinder, and the Federal Surveyor's stamps. The ghost of the past wasn't here to mourn. She was here to provide the data. I looked out at the ocean. The tide was turning. The water was coming back, and it was bringing a reckoning with it. Chloe thought she was selling a house. She was actually trying to sell the Atlantic, and the Atlantic doesn't belong to people like her.
The gut punch didn't come with a shout. It came with the sound of a diesel engine idling in my driveway and the sight of a sold sign hammered into the soft earth of my front lawn. I had gone into town for a supply run, fresh cedar shingles, a few bags of grit, and some heavy-duty marine sealant. When I pulled my truck back into the gravel drive, the world had changed. There was a white van parked near the dunes, the side emblazoned with a logo I recognized, Demolition and Site Prep Specialists. Chloe was standing on the deck, her white linen pants flapping in the breeze. She was holding a tablet and pointing toward the east wing of the cottage, the wing where master bedroom sat, where Elena and I had spent 40 winters. "What is this, Chloe?" I asked, stepping out of the truck. My voice was calm, but there was a vibration in my chest that felt like a bridge failing. She didn't look guilty. She looked triumphant. "Arthur, you're back. I was going to wait for the party to tell you, but the developers are ahead of schedule. We closed this morning. The Azure Sands Group was very impressed with the expedited processing of the paperwork." "We closed?" I repeated. "I haven't signed a deed, Chloe. I haven't even seen a contract." She stepped down from the deck, her face a mask of patronizing concern. "Arthur, you were so confused last week. You kept saying you wanted to simplify things. I used the power of attorney we had notarized. It was for your own protection, dear. The house is already in escrow, and the demolition of the unsafe structures, that's this cottage, starts on Monday." I felt the air leave my lungs. A power of attorney. I knew I hadn't signed one, which meant she'd gone to a notary with a man who looked like me, or she'd forged the digital signature using the maintenance logs she'd stolen from my desk. She hadn't just sold my home, she'd erased my existence as a decision-maker. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I've seen enough structural failures to know that when a building is collapsing, you don't stand under the beam and scream. You find the exit. "I see," I said. I turned and walked into the house. I could hear Chloe behind me, her voice trailing off about silver palms and ocean view suites. I went straight to my study and locked the door. I could hear her knocking, but I ignored it. I sat at my desk and pulled out my old leather field bag. I didn't reach for my bank statements. I reached for the law. Chloe thought I was a retired man with a hobby. She forgot that I spent 30 years as a senior inspector for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I wasn't just a guy who liked the water. I was the guy who controlled it. I opened my laptop and bypassed the residential internet, tethering to a secure hotspot I keep for my old consulting work. I logged into the Regulatory Analysis and Management System, ORM2, the federal database for every coastal permit in the country. I searched the coordinates for my property. Nothing.
I searched the name Azure Sands Development. I found a filing for a luxury resort complex, but the status was marked pending missing jurisdictional determination. I felt a cold, surgical fury settle over me. Chloe and her developers had bypassed federal law. To build that resort, they needed to dredge the marsh and bulkhead the shoreline. Under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, they needed a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. They didn't have one. I pulled up the bathymetric charts I'd made 6 months ago. I compared them to the Azure Sands proposed site plan, which I found in Chloe's digital restructuring folder. I'd bypassed her password days ago. They were planning to build the infinity pool directly over a submerged aquatic vegetation bed. That's a federal violation. They were planning to level the primary dunes, which are protected under the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, CBRA. Chloe hadn't just sold my land, she'd sold a piece of the United States coastline that was legally unbuildable. She had taken millions of dollars from a development group under false pretenses, using a forged document to sell a buildable lot that was in reality a federally protected sanctuary. But the audit went deeper. I looked at the bank transfer records she'd left open on her tablet earlier that week. I'd taken photos of the screens while she was in the bathroom. She hadn't just taken a commission, she had redirected the earnest money into an offshore account, and she had siphoned $150,000 from Maya's 25-29 college savings plan to cover the closing costs and the down payment on her own new penthouse in the city. She was hollowed out. She was a social climber who had run out of rungs and had started using her own family as a ladder. I leaned back in my chair. The house creaked, the cedar groaning as the wind picked up. Chloe thought she had won. She thought the sold sign was the final word. She didn't realize that in the eyes of the federal government, that sign was nothing more than a confession. I pulled out a stack of Form 4345, the application for Department of the Army permit. I didn't fill one out. I filled out a violation report form. I used the correct professional terminology. I cited the mean high water line. I documented the encroachment on riparian rights. I attached the bathymetric data that proved the resort's plan would cause catastrophic erosion to the neighboring properties, a takings violation that would trigger a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit. I wasn't just auditing a sale, I was auditing a crime. Chloe knocked on the door again. "Arthur, don't be like this. I've ordered a car for you. We can go look at Silver Palms this afternoon. They have a lobster lunch on Fridays." "I'm not hungry, Chloe," I said, my voice flat and cold. "I'm just finishing some paperwork." "Good," she said, her voice bright with relief. "I knew you'd come around to the logic of it." She didn't know the logic she was dealing with. She was playing with real estate. I was playing with federal servitude. She was looking at a penthouse. I was looking at 33 CFR Part 326, the enforcement regulations for unauthorized activities in federal waters. The gut punch had landed, but I wasn't the one who was going to be doubled over. I was the one who had spent my life studying how to withstand the surge.
The professional coldness I had cultivated 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers is a shield, but it has a crack. That crack is 7 years old, smells like salt air, and goes by the name Maya. I found her an hour after the demolition crew arrived. She wasn't building stone walls anymore. She was sitting behind a clump of sea oats in the primary dunes, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her face was a mess of tears and sand. When she saw me, she didn't run. She just stayed frozen, as if she were trying to blend into the landscape before it was hauled away in a dump truck. "Grandpa, the men said the sea monsters are coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. They said that's why they have to knock down the house, to build a big wall so the monsters don't get us. They said we have to go live in the city where it's safe. I felt a surge of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. Chloe hadn't just stolen the house, she was terrorizing the child to justify the theft. She was using a little girl's imagination to paint our sanctuary as a place of danger, all to make the transition to a city penthouse seem like a rescue mission. "There are no monsters here, Maya," I said, sitting down in the sand beside her. I didn't care about the dampness on my trousers. "The only thing coming is a little bit of noise, and I promise you, this house isn't going anywhere." "But Mommy said the money from my big school is gone," said Maya, looking at me with wide, haunting eyes. "She said the ocean ate it, and that's why we have to sell the beach." That was the second strike. I'd suspected it during my audit, but hearing it from the child's mouth made it real. Chloe had sat this girl down and told her that her future, the college fund Elena and I had meticulously built since the day Maya was born, had simply vanished into the sea. It was a cover story for the $150,000 Chloe had siphoned off to pay the earnest money on her social climbing lifestyle. Chloe wasn't just an overreacher, she was a predator who fed on the futures of those she was supposed to protect. She'd hollowed out Maya's security to buy herself a seat at a table where she didn't belong. I walked Maya back to the house, keeping my pace slow and steady. I could see Chloe on the deck, nursing a glass of white wine and talking loudly into her phone about curb appeal and site optimization. She looked at us, at the sand on my clothes and the tears on Maya's face, and she didn't see people, she saw obstacles to be managed. "Arthur, there you are," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "The movers will be here at 8 tomorrow morning. I've already tagged the furniture we're keeping. The rest, well, Julian says it's too distressed for the new place. We'll just have it hauled off with the debris." Debris. That was her word for Elena's hand-carved dining table, for the rocking chair where I'd read Maya every story she'd ever heard. I ignored her. I took Maya into the kitchen and made her a cup of hot chocolate, the way Elena used to, with a dash of cinnamon and exactly 3 marshmallows. I watched her small hands grip the mug, and the professional hunter in me, the man who had shut down illegal bridge projects and seized contaminated vessels, fully woke up. In my career, we had a term for this: irreparable harm. It's the threshold the government uses to issue a permanent injunction. When a child is being lied to and her future is being liquidated to buy a designer handbag, that is the definition of irreparable harm. I went back to my study. I didn't look at the ocean this time. I looked at the bank records I'd mirrored from Chloe's cloud storage. She had used Maya's 529 college savings plan as her personal piggy bank. She'd made the withdrawals under the guise of educational expenses, but the trail led directly to a high-end interior designer in Portland and a jeweler on Congress Street. She had committed Internal Revenue Code Section 529 college savings fraud, a federal tax violation, alongside the wire fraud she'd committed by sending those funds offshore to her offshore account. Chloe thought she was playing a game of real estate. She thought she was just optimizing the family's assets. She didn't realize that she'd just committed a series of felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences. I picked up a piece of the cobalt seaglass from the jar on the sill. It was cold and hard in my hand. "I wasn't born yesterday, Chloe," I whispered. The motivation had shifted. Before, it was about the cottage. It was about the memory of my wife. Now, it was about the girl in the kitchen. Chloe had targeted the one thing I valued more than the shoreline, and in doing so, she had removed any reason I had for mercy. I opened my USACE field kit and pulled out a fresh stack of notice of violation templates. I didn't fill them out in my name. I drafted them with the precise cold language of a federal auditor.
I cited the Coastal Zone Management Act. I noted the Section 10 violation for the unauthorized pier the resort was planning to build over the SAV beds. Chloe was a social climber who failed to account for the bedrock. She thought I was the dirt she could pave over. She didn't realize I was the granite beneath it. I checked my watch, 5:15 p.m. The tide was at its lowest point. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real.
The trap I built for Chloe was a masterclass in federal servitude. In the Army Corps of Engineers, we don't just stop projects, we make them legally radioactive. Chloe was so focused on the glitter of the finish line that she never checked the tide charts, and she certainly didn't check the regulatory history of the ground she was standing on. I constructed a 4-layered trap, each one designed to snap shut the moment she tried to cash the final check. Layer 1, the bait of compliance. I stopped fighting. That evening, I walked out to the deck and handed Chloe a signed consent to transfer form. It was a dummy document, filled with enough whereas and heretofore clauses to look official to a social climber, but legally it was a conditional statement of interest that required the buyer to prove full regulatory compliance before it became binding. I told her I'd had a moment of clarity and realized she was right about the maintenance. I even thanked her for looking out for me. Her ego was so large that she didn't see the surrender as a tactic, she saw it as a triumph of her superior intellect. She immediately called the Azure Sands board and told them the final obstacle had been cleared and they should expedite the heavy machinery. Layer 2, the jurisdictional freeze. While Chloe was celebrating with her developer friends, I used my old federal credentials to file an emergency jurisdictional determination. I didn't file it as Arthur, the homeowner. I filed it as a whistleblower report under 33 CFR Part 326. I documented that the resort's proposed footprint would encroach upon a special aquatic site. The moment that report hit the USACE system, a regulatory hold was automatically placed on the property title. To a bank, a property with an open JD is as valuable as a bucket of salt. It freezes all financing and makes the deed legally unmarketable until a full federal audit is completed. Layer 3, the endangered species shield. I knew from Elena's old storm logs exactly where the piping plovers and roseate terns nested. These birds are protected under the Endangered Species Act, ESA. I took high-resolution photos of a nesting pair on the northern dune, the very spot Chloe's demolition crew planned to use as a staging area. I sent those photos along with a formal notice of intent to sue for violations of the ESA to the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In the eyes of the federal government, a piping plover nest carries more legal weight than a billion-dollar resort. You can't move a pebble within 500 feet of those nests during breeding season without a federal permit that takes years to acquire. Layer 4. The farewell party. I told Chloe I wanted to host a farewell to the coast party on Sunday. I encouraged her to invite the board members of Azure Sands and her high society friends from the city. I told her I wanted to go out with dignity and show them the potential of the land one last time. She loved the idea. She saw it as her coming out party as a major player in the coastal real estate market. She spent the entire Saturday hiring caterers and ordering champagne. What she didn't know was that I had sent out 3 other invitations. I invited David Vance, a senior attorney from the Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division. I invited Special Agent Miller from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division to discuss the unexpected withdrawals from a 529 account.
And I invited my old boss at the USACE, Colonel Henderson, to perform an on-site compliance verification. I spent the morning before the party polishing the blue seaglass jar on the windowsill. I looked at the cobalt shards and thought about the $150,000 Chloe had stolen from Maya. I thought about the sea monsters she had used to scare a 7-year-old girl. Chloe thought she was hosting a celebration of her new life. She was actually hosting the opening night of her own federal prosecution. I used the correct professional terminology when I spoke to the caterers about where to set the tables. I made sure they were placed exactly below the mean high water mark on the section of the beach that is technically public trust land and cannot be privately owned or developed. Chloe was a social climber who didn't understand the difference between a deed and a federal navigational servitude. She thought she owned the view. She was about to find out that the United States government owns the ground beneath it. I checked my watch. 1 p.m. The guests would be arriving in 3 hours. The tide was coming in, and the swell was higher than predicted. He had more front than a department store window, I whispered to myself, thinking of Chloe's brazenness. The trap was set. The documents were filed. The sea monsters were finally coming, but they weren't from Maya. They were coming for the woman who tried to sell the ocean. I closed the folder. I made coffee. I waited.
The afternoon sun was hanging low over the Atlantic, casting long, bruised shadows across the dunes. The tide was pushing in hard, the waves thundering against the pilings with a rhythmic, heavy pulse that felt like a heartbeat. Chloe had done a proper job of the decor. White linens, crystal flutes, and enough orchids to fill a funeral parlor. She was wearing a silk dress the color of a shallow reef, drifting among the guests with a glass of champagne in one hand and a look of absolute predatory victory on her face. There were 12 of them, the board of azure sands, looking uncomfortable in their expensive loafers on my weathered deck, and a handful of Chloe's city friends who looked at the ocean as if it were a backdrop for a photo shoot. "Arthur, dear, come join us," Chloe chirped, her voice cutting through the sound of the surf. She draped an arm around my shoulder, but I didn't move. I felt like a pillar of granite. "We were just telling Mr. Sterling here about the vision for the Azure Sanctuary. We're going to start the demolition of this old relic on Monday. It's the end of an era, but the start of something so much more refined." Mr. Sterling, the developer, nodded. "It's a prime piece of coastline, Arthur. You're lucky your daughter-in-law had the foresight to bring us in. Most people let these properties just wash away." I looked at him. I looked at all of them. "The ocean doesn't take what isn't offered, Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was low, carrying beneath the wind. Chloe's grip on my shoulder tightened. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into chips of ice. "Arthur, don't be tiresome. The paperwork is done. The check is in escrow. Let's not make a scene in front of our guests." "I'm not making a scene, Chloe," I said, stepping away from her. "I'm making a report." I checked my Casio. 4:30 p.m. Right on time. The sound of a heavy diesel engine, a real one, not a luxury toy, rumbled from the driveway. A black Tahoe and a white government truck with the USACE crest on the door pulled up. 3 men and a woman stepped out. They weren't wearing linen. They were wearing tactical vests and windbreakers with Federal Agent and USACE stenciled in bold yellow letters. The chatter on the deck died instantly. The only sound was the wind and the waves. "Arthur Vance?" one of the men asked, walking up the steps. It was David Vance from the DOJ. He looked at the champagne and the orchids with a profound look of boredom. "Right here, David," I said. Chloe stepped forward, her voice raising an octave. "I'm sorry, who are you? This is a private event. If you're here about the construction permits, my consultants have already filed the—"
"Your consultants lied, Mrs. Vance," Colonel Henderson said, stepping onto the deck. He looked at her with the same expression he used for structural failures. "I'm Colonel Henderson, District Commander for the Army Corps of Engineers. We received a whistleblower report regarding unauthorized activities on a federal shoreline, specifically a violation of Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act." Sterling, the developer, went pale. "Now wait a minute, Colonel. We have a preliminary jurisdictional determination that says—" "You have a forged document, Mr. Sterling," David Vance interrupted, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "We've traced the origin of the approval you received. It didn't come from the USACE. It came from a server in the Portland district that was accessed using a stolen credential, a credential that was traced back to a laptop registered to your estate restructuring consultant, Chloe Vance." Chloe's glass slipped from her hand. It shattered on the cedar deck, the champagne soaking into the wood Elena had spent decades waxing. That's impossible. I was only trying to help Arthur. He's confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." "I'm not confused about the mean high water mark, Chloe," I said. I walked over to the blue seaglass jar on the windowsill and picked it up. "And I'm not confused about the law. You sold this lot as a buildable site, but according to the bathymetric data recorded in my wife's logs over 40 years, data that I've verified with a federal surveyor's stamp, 70% of the Azure Sanctuary footprint is below the federal high water line. That makes it public trust land. It can't be sold, it can't be built on, and it certainly can't be used as collateral for a resort loan." You sabotaged it," she hissed, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. "You old fool! I was giving you a life. I was making us rich." "You were stealing from a child, Chloe." Special Agent Miller stepped forward from the back of the group. He held up a set of bank records. "I'm with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We've been tracking the $150,000 you restructured from Maya Vance's 529 college savings plan. We also have the wire transfer records to an offshore account in the Caymans. That's wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." The social climbers and the board members were already backing away, trying to melt into the dunes. Sterling looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Chloe, you told us the title was clear. You told us the old man was incompetent." "He is incompetent," she screamed, her voice cracking like a dry hull. "He's a hermit. He's nothing." "I am a senior inspector for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and this cottage is a federal survey station. I've been recording the literal drift on this coast since before you were born. You thought you were selling a house. You were actually trying to sell a piece of the United States maritime defense infrastructure." Colonel Henderson nodded. "Mrs. Vance, we're issuing an immediate permanent injunction. This property is being designated as a federal conservation easement. No construction, no demolition, no Azure sands. And Mr. Sterling, your company is being served with a multi-million-dollar fine for attempted habitat destruction of an endangered species nesting site. We found the piping plovers you tried to pave over." The silence that followed was heavy. Chloe looked around at the broken glass, the orchids, and the cold, gray ocean she had tried to treat as a commodity. She looked at me, and for the first time she saw the man I was. Not the dear Arthur she could pat on the head, but the man who had held back the surge. "Maya's money is being returned to the trust," Agent Miller said, his voice as cold as the salt spray. "And you, Mrs. Vance, are under arrest. We have a federal warrant for wire fraud and forgery of a power of attorney." Chloe didn't fight when the handcuffs went on. She just looked smaller, her silk dress fluttering in the wind, looking like a piece of debris that the ocean had finally decided to spit back out. As they led her down the gravel drive towards the Black Tahoe, she didn't look at the house. She didn't look at the dunes.
She just looked at her heels, sinking into the mud. "I took you for a mug," Sterling said to me as he was led away by the federal marshals. "I know," I said. "Most people do, right until the tide comes in." The guests scrambled for their cars, leaving behind the champagne and the expensive restructuring plans fluttering in the breeze. I stood on the deck with Colonel Henderson. "You did a proper job of it, Arthur," he said, looking out at the Atlantic. "The house stands," I said. "The house stands, Colonel." I walked back into the kitchen. Maya was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, but her shivering had stopped. I picked up the blue seaglass jar and handed it to her. "Are the sea monsters gone, Grandpa?" she asked. "They're gone, Maya," I said. "The ocean took them home." I sat down in my armchair. The house creaked, a familiar, comforting sound. The orchids were wilting in the salt air, and the white linens were stained, but the pilings were deep in the rock. I checked my Casio. 6 p.m. High tide. Chloe had more front than a department store window, but the window broke, and the department store is closed.
6 months have passed since the wind took the champagne and the federal marshals took Chloe. The cottage smells of cedar and wood smoke again. The sharp, intrusive scent of citrus perfume, long since washed away by the Atlantic salt. Chloe is currently residing in a federal correctional facility in Connecticut, awaiting sentencing on multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. Her social climbing shoes have been replaced by standard-issue slip-ons. From what my daughter tells me, Chloe still spends her yard time trying to consult the other inmates on how to restructure their commissary accounts. Some habits don't die. They just find smaller rooms to live in. The Azure Sands Resort never broke ground. Once the Department of Justice slapped the permanent injunction on the property, the investors scattered like gulls at the sight of a hawk. The development company declared bankruptcy 2 months later, their visionary project legally dead and buried under a mountain of federal noncompliance reports. My daughter is back in the city, but she visits every weekend. We don't talk about Chloe much. We talk about the garden, the tides, and the way Maya is growing. The $150,000 Chloe siphoned off was fully recovered through the liquidation of Chloe's personal assets, including that Piaget watch and the penthouse she never actually moved into. Maya's 529 account is not only restored, it's locked in a trust that requires my physical signature to access. The Shoreline is quiet now. The sold sign was hauled away with the rest of the debris. In its place, I've worked with the USACE to designate this stretch of coast as a protected research station. The piping plovers have a peaceful sanctuary, and I have a reason to keep my laser levels calibrated. I'm sitting on the deck today. The Atlantic is a deep, bruised purple, the whitecaps rolling in like the cavalry. Maya is at my feet, her hands covered in sand. She isn't building walls to hide from monsters anymore. She's building a harbor. "Grandpa, look! The water is filling the basin, but the stones aren't moving," she shouted, her voice bright and clear against the wind. "That's because you built it on the rock, Maya," I told her. "Everything else is shifting sand." I checked my Casio watch. 9:15 a.m. The tide is coming in, exactly as the charts predicted. I reached out and touched the blue seaglass jar on the table beside me. I pulled out a piece of the cobalt glass, the one Elena found on our anniversary. It felt solid, permanent, and earned. Chloe thought she could take a shortcut through a 40-year marriage and a 30-year career. She thought she could outrun the tide because she had a faster car. She forgot that the ocean doesn't care how fast you are. It only cares how deep your pilings go. I've seen a lot of things wash up on this beach. Plastic, driftwood,
broken dreams of developers who thought they could master the Maine coast. Most of it gets tumbled until it's gone, but the rock remains. The cottage remains. I stood up, the old cedar boards supporting me without a single creak. I picked up my heavy coffee mug, the one that still tastes faintly of wood smoke and history. The air is fresh, the horizon is clear, and the future is secure. The outcome was always going to be the same. You can't sell the Atlantic, and you certainly can't take it for a mug. I walked down to the water's edge, my boots sinking into the firm, cold silt. I didn't look at the empty space where the azure sanctuary was supposed to be. I looked at the girl with the stones. "The harbor looks strong, Maya," I said. "You've done a proper job of it." She looked up and smiled, and in that moment, I saw Elena. The line was unbroken. I put the tools away. I made coffee. I stayed.